Hello everyone. Today we will discuss about the ventral part of the diencephalon, that includes hypothalamus and subthalamus. The objectives are to learn about hypothalamus, its boundaries, parts, connections, functions, subthalamus, basal nuclei and clinical anatomy. The hypothalamus, it is the part of diencephalon. It is the collection of the nuclei and associated fibers that lie beneath the thalamus. So, it is part of the diencephalon. It lies in the floor of the lateral wall of the third ventricle. It is the head ganglion of the autonomic nervous system because it takes part in the control of many visceral and metabolic activities of the body. So, anatomically it includes the floor of the third ventricle or the structures in the interpeduncular fossa. The lateral wall of the third ventricle below the hypothalamic sulcus. The boundaries as seen from the base of the brain, it is bounded anteriorly by the posterior perforated substance. Here you can make out. Then on each side the optic tract and the crus cerebri. So, as seen in the sagittal section of the brain, it is bounded anteriorly by the lamina terminalis, inferiorly by the floor of the third ventricle, posterior-superiorly by the hypothalamic sulcus. So, the arrow is showing the hypothalamic sulcus between the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So, the parts of the hypothalamus is subdivided into three different parts. Those are the optic part, which is anterior or the supraoptic region, the middle part known as the tuberal region, and the posterior part is called the mammillary region. So, overall it is having three parts. One is anterior part, the middle part and the posterior part. Excuse me. Then in the optic part we can see the preoptic nucleus, the supraoptic nucleus, paraventricular nucleus above the supraoptic and lateral nuclei, then the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that is above the optic chiasma. In the tuberal part we can observe the dorsomedial nucleus, the ventromedial nucleus. So, other nucleus in the tuberal part includes the tuberal nucleus lateral to the ventromedial nucleus and also the arcate nucleus in the floor of the third ventricle. Here we are not able to see those nuclei. In the mammillary part we are having the posterior nucleus and the lateral nucleus. So, diagrammatically we can represent the hypothalamus and the nuclei present in the hypothalamus in the different region like this. That is, in the preoptic region we are having the paraventricular nucleus, preoptic nucleus, the supraoptic nucleus, and in the tuberal region here you can observe the dorsomedial nucleus and the ventromedial nucleus, arcate or the infundibular nucleus. So, in this diagram we can observe the arcate nucleus, and in the mammillary part we can have the posterior nucleus and the lateral nucleus. So, coming to the important connections of the hypothalamus, the afferents is from the spinal cord and the brain stem, and it is also connected to the several centers associated with the olfactory pathways. Then the efferents is to the supraoptic hypophyseal tract from the optic nuclei to the parts posterior and the pars tuberalis and the pars intermedia of the hypophysis cerebri. The mammillothalamic tract, mammillategmental tract, and the tuberoinfundibular tract. The functions of the hypothalamus: it controls the body temperature, it controls the thirst and urine output, it controls the food intake, that is hunger and satiety center, it controls the anterior pituitary hormone secretion. So, by forming the releasing hormones or release inhibiting hormones, the hypothalamus regulates the secretion of TSH or the corticotrophin, ACTH, somatotrophin, STH, prolactin, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone and melanocyte stimulating hormone by the parts anterior of the hypophysis cerebri. So, it mainly controls the anterior pituitary hormone secretion, and it controls the uterine contraction of milk ejection, serves as a major autonomic nervous system coordinating center. It plays a role in emotional and behavioral pattern like emotion, fear, rage, aversion, pleasure or reward. All these are controlled by the hypothalamus, the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. Then it participates in the sleep wake cycle. The clinical aspect: the lesions of the hypothalamus give rise to the following syndromes: the obesity, Froelic's syndrome or Lawrence-Moon-Wedel syndrome, the diabetes insipidus, diencephalic autonomic epilepsy characterized by flushing, sweating, salivation, lacrimation, tachycardia or retardation of respiratory rate and unconsciousness, etc. Then sexual disturbances, either precocity or the impotence. Then disturbance of sleep may be the somnolence or narcolepsy, hyperglycemia and glycosuria, the acute ulceration in the upper part of the gastrointestinal tract. Now, the subthalamus: it lies between the midbrain and the thalamus, medial to the internal capsule and globus pallidus. So, it consists of the grey matter and the white matter. The grey matter, the cranial ends of the red nucleus and substantia nigra, subthalamic nucleus, the zona incerta. Then in the white matter, it includes the cranial ends of lemnisci lateral to the red nucleus, dentothalamic tract along the rubrothalamic fibers, ansa lenticularis, fasciculus lenticularis, subthalamic fasciculus. The clinical aspect: the discrete lesions of subthalamic nucleus results in hemibalismus, which is characterized by involuntary choreiform movements on the opposite side of the body, and there will be abolished by the ablation of the globus pallidus, anterior ventral nucleus of thalamus or the corticospinal tract. Now, we will discuss about the basal nuclei. So, the basal nuclei are the subcortical and intracerebral masses of grey matter, and it forms an important part of extrapyramidal system. So, the basal nuclei also it is known as the basal ganglia. It includes corpus striatum, the amygdaloid body and the claustrum. So, again the corpus striatum divides into the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. So, again the lentiform nucleus is divided into the putamen, which is present laterally, and globus pallidus medially. So, here in this picture you can see the different group of nuclei which forms the basal ganglia. So, the basal ganglia, there are three parts: corpus striatum, claustrum and amygdaloid body. the claustrum is the saucer like structure which is present in the lateral aspect, and the caudate nucleus, that is the head part and the tail part, is depicted here, and then the lentiform nucleus is having putamen and the globus pallidus. The corpus striatum, it comprises the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. The caudate nucleus, it is a C-shaped or comma-shaped nucleus surrounded by the lateral ventricle. The concavity of the C encloses the thalamus and the internal capsule. So, the parts of the caudate nucleus, it is having the head, body and the tail. The head forms the floor of the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. So, in this diagram you can observe the head represented by a oval shape here, then the medial wall of the anterior limb of the internal capsule. So, here the internal capsule you can observe. So, the head forms the medial wall of the anterior limb of the internal capsule. So, now the body. The body forms the floor of the central part of the lateral ventricle, and it lies medial to the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So, here in this picture you can observe it is lying close or medial to the posterior limb of the internal capsule. It is separated from the thalamus by stria terminalis and thalamo-striate vein, and superiorly it is related to fronto-occipital bundle and corpus callosum. Now, the tail, it forms the roof of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle and ends by joining the amygdaloid body at the temporal pole. It is related medially to the stria terminalis and laterally to the tapetum. Superiorly, sublentiform part of internal capsule and the globus pallidus. So, here you can see the lentiform nucleus. So, as the name indicates, it is a lens shaped nucleus and it is large in size also. It forms the lateral boundary of the internal capsule. It lies beneath the insula and the claustrum. So, the surfaces of the lentiform nucleus, it is having the lateral surface, medial surface and the inferior surface. So, here the inferior surface is related to the sublentiform part of internal capsule that separates it from the optic tract, the tail of the caudate nucleus and the inferior horn of lateral ventricle. So, the lateral surface is convex and is related to the external capsule, the claustrum, the outermost capsule insula, and is grooved by the lateral striate arteries. So, the lentiform nucleus is divided into two parts by a thin lamina of the white matter. The larger part which is present in the lateral aspect is called the putamen. It is similar to the caudate nucleus structurally, and it contains small cells, and the smaller part which is present medially is called the globus pallidus. So, it is made up of large motor cells. So, putamen is having the small cells, whereas the globus pallidus is having the large cells. So, in another picture, in the dissected part, we can observe the pallidus which is represented by P and the globus putamen represented by P and the globus pallidus represented by letter G. So, these two are separated by a thin lamina of the white matter which is represented by the thin white line. So, morphologically the corpus striatum can be divided into the paleostriatum and the neostriatum. So, paleostriatum is the older and the primitive part. It is represented by the globus pallidus. The neostriatum is more recent in development. It is represented by the caudate nucleus and the putamen. So, now the connections of the caudate nucleus and putamen, because these two are structurally similar. The afferents from the cerebral cortex, particularly the area 4 and 6, the thalamus, that is from the medial, intralaminar and midline nuclei, the substantia nigra. The efferents chiefly to the globus pallidus, it also to the substantia nigra and to the thalamus. So, now the globus pallidus, the afferents mainly from the putamen and the caudate nucleus, and also from the substantia nigra, thalamus and the subthalamic nucleus. The efferents forms the three bundles, that is ansa lenticularis, fasciculus lenticularis and subthalamic fasciculus. The functions: it regulates the muscle tone and helps in smoothing voluntary movements. It controls the automatic associated movements. It influences the precentral motor cortex, help the cortex in execution of learned patterns of movements subconsciously. It contributes to cognitive function of brain. So, now the amygdaloid body, it is a nuclear mass in the temporal lobe lying anterosuperior to the lentiform, that is inferior one of the lateral ventricle, and topographically it is continuous with the tail of the caudate nucleus. Here we can make out the tail end of the caudate nucleus. At the tail end we can observe the amygdaloid body, but it is functionally related to the stria terminalis and it is a part of the limbic system. The afferents is from the olfactory tract, and efferents, it gives rise to the stria terminalis that ends in the anterior commissure, anterior perforated substance and the hypothalamic nuclei. The function of this is emotional control. So, next is the claustrum. So, here we can observe a saucer shaped nucleus that is situated between the putamen and the insula. Now, the clinical aspect. So, the lesions in the basal ganglia, they are produce the abnormal movements or the posture or changes in tone. The Parkinsonism. So, lesions of the corpus striatum lead to the Parkinsonism. The features are the hypertonicity or lead pipe rigidity, loss of automatic associated movements and facial expression, involuntary movements like tremors, choreoform movements, athetoid movements, continuous breathing movements of trunk and limbs. Voluntary movements may be impossible. So, here you can see the features like masked facial expression, the stooped posture, rigidity, forward tilt of the trunk, flexed elbows and wrist, reduced arm swinging, slightly flexed hips and knees, then shuffling short stepped gait and trembling of the extremities. The chorea, it means dancing. It is a form of involuntary movement characterized by fine random movements of hands and feet. So, these movements are disorganized. It is caused due to the diseases of the caudate nucleus. Athetosis, it is a form of movement which is slow and repetitive. It occurs due to the lesion of the putamen. So, here you can see the picture showing the movement of the fingers. Now, the questions for assignment: hypothalamus, boundaries, nuclei present in it and its function, caudate nucleus, components of basal ganglia, parts of corpus striatum, lentiform nucleus. So, one case scenario: a 65-year-old person developed tremors in his hands. He cannot eat his food comfortably. His movements have slowed down and walks by bending forwards. There is mostly a tear in his eyes with no emotional expressions. What is the likely diagnosis? What is the line of treatment? Thank you.